Thanks so much for tuning in this afternoon. Thank you so much to Democracy Policy Network for having me here today to be a part of the Statehouse Futures Conference. It's really great to be here and to be talking with so many of you today about my favorite topic, which is polling and messaging to shape effective narratives. So over the course of the next 40 minutes or so, 35 to 40 minutes, we'll be exploring, these topics, and happy to answer any questions as they're coming up, or happy to also just, answer a bunch of them at the end as well. So you can just go ahead and dive right in. All right. So just a brief introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm your host for this session. My name is Danielle Deiseroth. I'm the Executive Director at Data for Progress. I previously led our organization's polling on issues related to climate change, energy, and the environment, as well as some other major policy issues. My background, I come to Data for Progress by way of market research, as well as the Bernie 2020 presidential campaign. I live in New York City and also spend a great deal of my time in Washington, D.C., but my home is always Pittsburgh, PA, if we have any Pennsylvanians tuning in. And outside of work, I love to cook and hang out with my dog. So if you're not familiar with Data for Progress, a little bit about who we are. This is our amazing staff, as you can see here to the left. We are a think tank and polling firm that is focused on arming the progressive movements with data-backed tools that they need to fight for a more equitable future. We have an amazing team of technologists, pollsters, data analysts, and communications experts. And we all spend our time collectively producing polling, data-based message testing, and original policy generation for the progressive movement. And you may have seen our work in the media or cited by folks like the White House or senators or other progressive lawmakers. So Data for Progress does a couple of things, as I just mentioned. We do some traditional horse race polling, which you probably see a lot in the media, especially leading up to elections. But for the purpose of today, we're going to focus on what polling that we can do to drive narrative change. So we're going to focus on issue polling, assessing the popularity and salience of key policy issues, as well as message testing, understanding which messages about certain issues are the most persuasive and resonate among core constituency groups. So just a brief roadmap before we dive headfirst here. I'm first going to walk through just issue polling as a whole. What are some of the top issues and trends that we've seen over the past 6 to 12 months and how that might be impacting your work? Some tips and tricks that I have for messaging and message testing. And then finally, just walking through some case studies that Data for Progress has done with groups at the state level to help build progressive momentum around key policy issues. So let's first unpack some of the issues that matter the most to voters. And there are some issues with issue polling before we dive in. Voters are very complex. A single polling question doesn't necessarily tell us the complete story. And we always have to remember the polls are just a snapshot in time. While they can tell us a great deal and help point us in the right direction about what voters are thinking or what issues are most important to them, they're also a product of the time period in which they're conducted. And finally, we understand that polls are conducted in a vacuum, but there are many issues that impact Americans every single day. So how do we unpack and understand certain cross-pressured constituents who care about a whole host of issues and how that impacts their day-to-day lives? So a question I get a lot is, well, hey, inflation and the economy are the issues that I see people listing the most in all of these polls as the most important issue to them. But there are a lot of other issues that matter to voters across America, not just inflation and the economy, even though, as you can see here from this chart from a poll we did before the November midterm elections, that by far and away, inflation was one of the most frequently cited as the top issue to voters, among all voters, and also, as you'll see in some later slides, among core constituency groups like young people and people of color. But there's layers to this question. Okay, almost half of voters say that inflation is the most important issue to them, followed by jobs and the economy. But what does that actually mean? Do they care about who is causing inflation? Who has a plan to tackle it? While oftentimes you'll see headlines saying almost half of voters consider inflation the most important issue, it often stops at that and doesn't dive deeper. And that's an important thing to realize when you're looking at issue polling and how you're using issue polling in your own work, is that this one simple question is just kind of the tip of the iceberg to really understanding how folks are thinking and feeling about major issues. So as an example, we probed a little bit deeper on this question about inflation and try to understand, what do voters actually mean when they say they care about inflation? Again, this was a poll that we conducted shortly before the November midterm elections. And what you can see here is that large majorities of voters think that addressing rising costs means, expanding Social Security payments, or holding corporations accountable that are responsible for price gouging, raising the minimum wage. Under that umbrella term of inflation and jobs in the economy, there's a whole Christmas tree of different policies and attitudes that all fall under that same umbrella. So when looking at different polls and using polling in the work that you're doing, it's important to really probe deeper and to try to peel back the layers to understand the underlying motivations and what is the follow-on action. So you care about inflation? Let's talk about who's responsible for inflation. Let's talk about ways that we can address rising costs by holding corporations accountable, raising the minimum wage. There's definitely the importance of making sure that follow-on is there. And a simple question about what issues matter the most to voters, sometimes we need to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. This was a poll that we conducted last summer, shortly after the Dobbs decision was released. We found a pretty sobering statistic. Over half of voters think that the next generation of Americans will have fewer rights than the current generation. That's a pretty startling statistic. And this existential question of American freedoms and retaining basic individual rights weighs heavily on voters when they're evaluating what issues mean the most to them. So let's dive a little bit deeper into some of those core constituency groups that I mentioned earlier. First, we'll take a look at a group that's near and dear to my heart, and that of Data for Progress, which is young voters. According to the data firm Catalyst What Happened report, I highly recommend you read that if you have not yet. Young voters turned out at record numbers in the November midterm elections. And young voters, similar to the greater voting population, ranked inflation, abortion, and jobs in the economy as the top issues to them ahead of the elections. But again, let's take a look under the hood here. What are some of the underlying factors driving young voters' perceptions of participating in the voting process and how they perceive government as a whole? Because that impacts how they view all of these issues. So we conducted a number of polls after the Dobbs decision leading up to the November midterm elections. And what we found was that voters under 45 were reporting that they were more motivated to turn out over abortion access than voters over 45. This is a key factor here. If we remember back to that previous slide, abortion rights were, right up there with the economy as one of the most important issues to young voters. But we also see here that this is what's turning young folks out. They care about the issue of abortion. And young voters also care about how much they matter in the greater process of politics, government, and lawmaking. Another kind of sobering statistic here, similar to the slide I showed earlier about how voters are pessimistic about future generations having less rights than the current generation. Young folks are pessimistic about the extent to which their voice matters in elections. We see here that over half almost of young voters say that their vote doesn't matter much or at all. And when thinking about the issues that matter to you, this is a key statistic. Realizing that your vote actually means something is important. Another statistic that is sobering to me, at least, is that young people feel like, at least at the national level, Congress is not representing their generation. While we have seen, amazing lawmakers elected at the federal level that represent Gen Z and millennials, there's also a huge opportunity for a new generation of lawmakers, especially at the state level, to show how young leaders can drive change on the issues that Gen Z and millennials care about. So while these issues like inflation, jobs in the economy, abortion, student loan debt matter to young people, messengers matter a heck of a lot too. And knowing that young people's voices are heard and represented is key to driving change on many of these issues. Now let's look at another core constituency, voters of color. Again, we see a similar story here, very similar to the larger picture of all voters. Black, Latino, and AAPI voters most frequently cited inflation as one of the most important issues to them heading into the midterms. But we also see, a very similar tale as some of the previous slides, that voters of color were overwhelmingly concerned about their constitutional rights being taken away and worsening economic conditions for working Americans. So these concerns about quality of life and ability to retain basic freedoms encapsulate many of those issues, such as abortion, healthcare, Social Security, and the prevalence of good-paying jobs. We also did some deep dives into looking specifically just at women of color, voters and non-voters, to try to assess how they feel about participating in the voting process and lawmaking as a whole. And what we found is that a plurality of women of color say that they don't trust politicians to make a difference in their lives. Again, similar pessimism as we saw before among young people, that while politicians and lawmakers can talk about the issues, those words don't necessarily translate into action. And again, women of color say that they, maybe perhaps aren't involved in politics because they think that their voice doesn't make a difference. While women of color do report extraordinarily high rates of voter turnout, if those votes actually translate into action remains a question to be answered. And similar to young people, majorities of women of color say that they think there are too few leaders who identify as women of color in office. So again, there's a huge opportunity to elect a new generation, a new bench of lawmakers in the states that reflect folks who are actually living in those states, and a new generation of voters who are maybe perhaps pessimistic about the larger political process. And I'll finish up this section here with a slide about Latino voters. This is from our friends at Equis Research. I highly recommend you check out their post-mortem report if you haven't already. And I think this is a really interesting slide because, again, like we saw on one of those earlier slides, voters of color, our survey looked at Latino voters as well as Black and AAPI voters, showed that inflation was the top issue to those voters heading into the midterm elections. But as you can see here on this slide, Latino voters who ranked the economy and the cost of living as, their most important issue also didn't turn out at the rates that those who cited abortion did. So again, understanding those underlying motivations, knowing that a poll that says in a snapshot in time, inflation or the economy might be the most important issue, obscures those underlying motivations and those underlying assumptions about how the political process and lawmaking works as a whole. So some key takeaways to take away from this section on issue polling: dig deeper. If a headline, just clickbaity headline says so-and-so percent of voters care about inflation in the economy, this is red flashing lights, the only issue that matters to people, dig deeper. Understand what's driving that motivation and also follow that trend over time. Because someone says abortion is important to them in June and says that inflation is the most important issue to them in September doesn't mean they still don't care about abortion. They're just voters are often answering based on what headlines are of that day. The messenger matters. As I was saying earlier, young people and people of color are pessimistic about their representation in the government. And there's a huge opportunity to have, elect new lawmakers that, represent those core constituency groups and are especially effective messengers on key issues. And finally, actions speak louder than words. Again, combating that pessimism by communicating about policy wins early and often is, one antidote to combating some of that pessimism. Moving into the next section here about messaging tips and tricks, and I see some questions in the chat, and I think it's probably best to just answer those at the end, but I see them and I will get to them. So I have a couple of tips and tricks about messaging and message testing that I tell so many of our partners and colleagues that really are my rules to live by. The first one, show, don't tell. My 11th grade English teacher, Mrs. Booth, taught me this, and it still rings very true. When you're communicating about an issue, specify who you are impacting and how you're doing it. As I said earlier, my background is in climate change communication, so some of the examples I'm going to cite come from that realm. But I've done a lot of message testing about environmental justice, and that's a term that most voters have never heard of. And when we actually spell out communities that are impacted by the fossil fuel industry or by the clean energy transition, we found that to be a much more helpful and persuasive messaging tool than using blanket phrases like frontline communities or communities that have historically faced underinvestment. While so many of us here today are policy wonks that are well-versed in the policies that we're communicating to a general audience, it's really important to put ourselves in our audience's shoes and ensure that we're communicating in language that really emphasizes what we are doing rather than using terms that we may be, using every single day, but most voters may have never heard of before. The second rule that I like to tell folks to live by is to stay true to your own voice. Drawing on your lived experiences and the day-to-day realities that the constituents you serve are facing is a key way to make sure that your messages actually stick. Polling and message testing can certainly point you in the right direction and help illuminate key themes that you should touch upon in your messaging, but you don't want to sound like a robot. You want to sound like yourself. And when you're talking with constituents or folks that you're working with, it's not happening in the same vacuum as a poll. So it's important to remind yourself that you are a subject matter expert on this and that you should communicate in your own voice. A great example that I like to talk about is my home state senator, John Fetterman. Data for Progress conducted a huge analysis of communications from different candidates during the midterm elections. And one theme that one main finding that we had from that report is that Senator Fetterman was one of the most effective messengers among all candidates running for office across party lines on issues such as inflation and crime, in part because his voice was authentically his own. It was Pennsylvanian through and through. When you saw communication from John Fetterman about certain issues, it was explaining it to Pennsylvanians in the terms that they knew best. And an example that I had here, one of the most persuasive messages we tested from candidates across the political spectrum was about manufacturing at home, manufacturing the next generation of clean energy technologies at home. Even a senator from Pennsylvania, where there are plenty of fossil fuel jobs, is able to be persuasive talking about clean energy and this type of language. So I guess like an addendum to this slide is like staying true to your own voice, even on the thorniest of issues or issues you feel like you can't win. Staying true to yourself helps get you there and is more persuasive than you probably think. And the third rule I tell folks to live by is to know your audience. The way you talk about certain issues is going to differ depending on who you're talking to. And polling is a great tool to help you understand different signals about how you should be talking about issues to certain groups. I'll do a couple examples right here. Again, drawing on my experience as a climate change researcher, we found that emphasizing creating a sustainable world for future generations is a message that resonates a lot among voters over 45 and senior citizen voters. Meanwhile, young folks are extremely concerned about climate change. They understand the root causes of climate change, and they're particularly persuaded by messaging that specifically talks about reducing emissions. Maybe some of that wonkier language that does work among voters who are like young voters who are well versed in the issue of climate change. So making slight rhetorical tweaks depending on your audience, whether you're talking to your base of support, trying to persuade others who may not know as much about your issue or may not be as familiar, is really, really important. Another issue that we talk about a lot at Data for Progress is entitlements like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps. Young voters aren't as excited about protecting Social Security as older voters because they don't receive Social Security checks yet, for the most part. But talking about, paying into the system and being able to reap those benefits long term is helpful to young voters who may not be realizing those benefits yet, but will someday. So again, just really assessing who you're talking to and, pinpointing their key underlying motivations, as we just walked through in that past section, is a messaging tip that I live by. All right, so final section, over the next couple of slides here, I'm going to talk about the ways that Data for Progress has worked with groups at the state level to help build power. Before we dive in here, one thing that Data for Progress really aims to do is democratize data, especially in geographies where there typically isn't a whole lot of polling data. And we have observed, at least, that at the state level, there is a lack of widely available polling on major issues, especially when you look in comparison to polling on national issues. But so much change and progressive change at that happens at the state level. So these next few case studies illustrate how you can use polling and message testing to really drive progressive change in your states. So the first example, case study again, pretty near and dear to my heart from my adopted home of New York, is New York Public Power. We worked with New York Public Power to conduct a poll assessing New Yorkers' opinions toward building public renewables, public ownership of clean energy resources. And what we found was that by and large, New Yorkers largely supported building public renewables and broad community ownership of energy resources. And how the polling was helpful in this example was that we used it as part of a media campaign. As you can see here, we got a news article in City and State, which is a major publication in New York for those of you who aren't New Yorkers, read and followed closely by city and state legislators, as the name emphasizes. And this is probably my favorite thing that's ever happened to a DFP poll ever, but our polling results were on a billboard talking about how the percentage of New Yorkers who support public renewables was actually more than the percentage of New Yorkers who voted for Kathy Hochul. But it's not every day that you see your polling results on a billboard, for sure. And this sort of broad public media campaign helped diffuse the notion that New Yorkers don't care about public ownership of renewables. And the polling was really helpful in being able to say, no, New Yorkers do widely support this, and raising the salience of this issue in the media and through advertisements such as this billboard was helpful as part of the broader campaign to include building public renewables as part of the state's budget. Again, a second example, I feel like I'm citing a lot of examples from issues in states that are close to my heart, but that's the great privilege of getting to work here. Data for Progress is getting to drive change at home. The PA Whole Home Repair Act. So Data for Progress worked with People's Action in a similar case study as I just went through to conduct a poll about the repairing homes across Pennsylvania and providing Pennsylvanians, especially low-income Pennsylvanians, with resources to make improvements to their homes that improve air quality, help reduce emissions that contribute to climate change, and just improve their homes as a whole. And this was a really, really fascinating poll because what we found was that there was widespread support across party lines, across all major constituency groups, that were in support of the government assisting in helping homeowners make those repairs. And also we conducted some demographic questions, just understanding how many Pennsylvanians said that they couldn't afford key home repairs. That's another really important component of certain polls, is that in addition to just diving into the policy issues, also establishing a firm lay of the land and gaining some of those key statistics about your constituents' experiences, what they're facing on a day-to-day basis, and how that factors into the issues was really on display here in this poll. And again, another happy story here. This was a success. The Whole Home Repairs Act was a bipartisan bill that passed in the Pennsylvania state legislature. And now other states are considering adopting similar legislation. So again, we followed a pretty similar playbook here of conducting a poll, leveraging it to raise the salience in the media, and helping to build a public consensus around the popularity of the proposal and this policy. And the final case study that I'll walk through here is our work in Michigan. We collaborated with Evergreen Action, which is a national climate group that has a program in Michigan and some other states across the country, specifically around state-level climate policy. And we conducted a couple of polls with them in 2022 and 2023 around the Inflation Reduction Act, which passed last summer, as well as just Michiganders' broad support for addressing climate change and transitioning to clean energy. And this poll here on the left, you see, again, similar playbook: earned media, raise the salience, Michiganders support climate action, support Governor Whitmer, taking climate action. And then on the right here, this poll that we conducted earlier this year, we timed right around a large statewide convening of different climate coalition groups gathering together to talk about the Michigan's My Healthy Climate Plan and broader state level action on climate change. And this poll was distributed widely amongst coalition partners and provided some helpful insights to understand the landscape as they were considering strategic decisions around driving forward climate action. So some key takeaways from these case studies. The first is that polling can catalyze momentum. In the cases in our work in New York and Pennsylvania, earned media was a really essential part of that, about raising awareness for the issues. Timing matters. If you're conducting a poll as part of your organizing strategy, whether you want to plan to get earned media or plan it around an event, it's best to time your polling around a bigger event or milestone, such as a conference or a publication that really helps maximize the impact of the data. And finally, make sure you share what you learn with other partners. As I said earlier, there's a dearth of publicly available polling on issues at the state level. So be sure to share those findings with other folks and use that to help drive your momentum forward for the future. So I think I'm out of time, but please feel free to stay in touch. You can follow us on Twitter, on Instagram, subscribe to our newsletter. We have very funny headlines every week, and feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about anything I just talked about. and happy to answer any questions that I have in the time remaining. Okay, let me find my cursor here. Okay. I cannot seem to move my cursor back over to my laptop. So just go ahead and do that. All right. So just scrolling quickly through here, you're testing, Sebastian, your question, start using natural language understanding to analyze answers to qualitative questions. Oh, that's very interesting. So I assume that means you're trying to use AI to understand open-ended responses. With cadence, suggestions on the cadence of releasing surveys. If you're trying to observe any changes over time, that will take time. So you may not see changes right away. I would just recommend, I don't know what your time horizon looks like, but we typically observe changes no less than like a monthly. So if you're able to conduct polls on a monthly basis, that might be a good place to start, but would happy to chat more about specifics if that'd be helpful. Any other questions? Happy to answer them. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm going to put my email in the chat in case you didn't grab it, just if you want to follow up afterwards about anything. Top 2 takeaways I want you to remember. Polls are a snapshot in time, and be sure to read the fine print to understand what is really driving the results of those polls. And the second takeaway is that don't be afraid to use polling to help catalyze the momentum of the work you're trying to do at the state level. Polling can be an enormously useful tool to establish a social license for supporting certain policies. And it's widely available polling data can really drive power in a meaningful way.